Globalization is a misnomer. Not every country on the globe has participated in the process, and many have been left out of it. If the issues we're raising, including around economic development and climate change, are truly global, then we must find ways to constructively include all countries. Many African countries, for example, have had limited success with entering the global supply chains of the world's leading firms. We asked an expert on African economic development, as well as on issues of economic stratification and race, Professor GrieveChelwa, based in Zambia, to comment on how globalization has been felt in Africa. Welcome, Professor Chelwa. I'm so pleased to see you and so grateful that you have a few minutes to spend with us today. Would you mind just starting by introducing yourself to the audience and give us your name and your affiliations?
Thanks, Professor Milberg. Thanks for asking me to do this. So my name is GrieveChelwa. I am currently the Director of Research at the Institute on Race, Power and Political Economy at the New School, which is a new research institute within the New School. Prior to this, I used to teach economics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa.
Can you just say briefly about your own research before we get into asking you some questions about globalization?
Thanks. I think that's interesting. I tend not to be a very disciplined researcher, but my core interests and obsessions are thinking about African economic development issues, and particularly applying a political economy lens to thinking about those kinds of issues.
Well, we're honored to have you. You are the perfect person to tap for some of the questions that we want to ask you today. So let's jump into the questions, and they're broad questions, and we really want your perspective on African economic development in the face of the opportunities and challenges of globalization. When we discuss globalization, Africa is often left out of the discussion. Can you speak of any African country's experience with globalization? Are there any success stories that you want to discuss?
That's an important question, Will. And I think and you're very right when you say when it comes to questions around globalization, Africa is often left out of the discussion. I think in terms of values, in terms of trade values, the contribution of Africa is quite insignificant from a value point of view. From a volume point of view, things look a little bit different. And even the nature of sort of Africa's interaction with the world is very much skewed towards what one may call the export of primary export commodities, right? That's certainly been the history. There are some countries on the continent that have been able to participate in some meaningful way, relatively much better than your typical African country. And here I think about the country I spent a lot of my life in, South Africa. South Africa is quite integrated from a globalization point of view relative to African peers. One also thinks about the North African countries. And there's this age-old debate about sub-Saharan. What is Africa? Is it Africa plus North Africa? Is it sub-Saharan Africa plus North Africa? But the North African countries are certainly do participate in some meaningful way in globalization. And so does South Africa. But the rest of the continent, one might say, is very much at the receiving end. Precisely given the structure of its integration and the structure of how it performs, how it integrates into world trade and into globalization in general.
So the successes, to the extent that they are there, are in the furthest northern parts of Africa and the furthest southern parts, and the many, probably 50 countries almost in between, have not benefited from the kind of liberalization and globalization that we've been talking about.
That's correct, Will. And I think the even more interesting question is, so there's a bit about participation in globalization, and then there's a question about whether it's been successful or not. And even in South Africa, for example, or in North Africa, let's talk about South Africa that I know quite well. Even there, the story is very complex. And it's a story of where globalization in South Africa has led to increases in inequality, right? Even before, for example, globalization became a thing, or at least the latest wave of globalization became a thing, South Africa's always had a problem of inequality because of its history, right? But I think some of these inequalities have been exacerbated precisely because of the way in which it has been integrated into the world system, as one would call it that, right? So those who have education, those who have capital, those who have the links, the connections, have done very well but a great majority of the country has been left behind.
I mean, one of the lessons from this short class is about the fact that when we talk about globalization, we talk often about different outcomes across countries. So some countries benefit, some do not. But in fact, what's also very important to recognize are the winners and losers within countries. And so
Correct.
even the African case, you're saying, shows the same kind of patterns. I'm going to ask you one final and very large question, maybe more hopeful looking. Can you discuss a few ways that the global economy could be redesigned to promote industrialization and development in Africa?
Where one begins to think about the global institutions that are supposed to coordinate things like trade.
Mm,
One thinks about the World Trade Organization in its present form. Perhaps one might think about, is there opportunities and avenues to reform the way WTO does its business? And I think because many of the now globalized countries, many of the countries that are industrialized, that have benefited from globalization, uh, did do so before we had WTO, and many of the sort of the rules and the rules and laws that govern world trade can be quite restrictive, can make it quite difficult for Zambia, for
right.
example, today do what the US did in the 19th century, to do what maybe South Korea did a little 50, or Japan, for example, what Japan did coming out of Second World War. So I think there's a place there to think quite, is the WTO as presently constituted, is it fit for purpose insofar as the African case and other developing countries are concerned? I think that's an important question to confront.
It's a great response, and it's a perfect segue actually. The other interview that we'll be doing in this portion of the course is with Professor Ha-Joon Chang,
Ah,
who
nice.
I suppose you've heard of, who
Yes.
has written precisely on this issue of the advantages of trade policy intervention in the 19th century, which promoted industrialization, and their
Yeah,
kind of disappearance in the
correct.
20th and late 20th and 21st century under the World
Correct.
Trade Organization. So I really appreciate that you moved in that direction and that you informed us more about kind of an African and Zambian perspective on the World Trade Organization, which is just a fascinating and important topic. So I want to thank you, Professor Chelwa, for your time. And I know your schedule is so busy, and I hope your stay in Brooklyn, New York is an excellent one. And thank you so much again for your expertise.
Thank you, Professor Milberg.
Through the interviews in this lesson, you have learned how globalization has left some countries out and learned about some policies that can bring about more equitable and just economic relations.